how can business and nations remain competitive in a global age? And today we have the pleasure of having with us Arianna Huffington, who is going to give the keynote on the decline of the middle class in America, which I guess is related to a book that just came out called Third World America, which I think is about, if I understood you correctly, Angelino recently, it's how politicians have been, on both sides, have been screwing the middle class for 30 years, and how they've been betraying the American dream. And I guess that the American dream has to do with entrepreneurship and innovation and stuff like that. So please welcome Arianna Huffington. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Luis, for organizing this wonderful gathering at a time when all across the globe we are all trying to come to terms with the fundamental shifts in our economy and in the way millions are living their lives. I wrote this book called Third World America, not because I really believe that America is a third world country, but because I believe that we are on this trajectory and that the fate of the middle class is central to whether America remembers and remains what it was intended to be, you know, a country where the American dream made it possible for everyone, no matter where they were born, to have a better life. You know, as an immigrant to this country, I came here believing that this is the country for the better life. And yet now, if you look at the statistics, America is number 10th in upward mobility, behind Sweden and Finland and Germany and France. So these countries are now doing the American dream better than we are doing it. Maybe we should sue them for a copyright violation. Or maybe we should recognize that the anger that has been unleashed around the country has legitimate roots in how broken the system is, that it has allowed what has happened to the middle class to happen. And I don't know how many of you watched the president's town hall meeting on CNBC when a voter, an Obama supporter, stood up and basically said, Mr. President, I'm exhausted. I'm exhausted of defending you. I'm exhausted of waiting. And she kind of gave voice to the fear that the American dream is over. And I only have 7 minutes, and I'm going to stick to my timetable. So while I'm going to depress you for the first 4 minutes, I'm going to make sure that for the last 3 minutes, you are left, as I have been left, completely optimistic about what we can do. So the gloomy part is the recognition that unemployment is here to stay for a long time. Even the president's new economic advisor, Austin Goolsbee, said so, that foreclosures continue to rise. We expect 3 million this year, and that every 30 seconds someone declares bankruptcy in America, and that nevertheless the administration and Congress are lacking the sense of urgency that existed when the financial system was about to collapse. And the question of how did we get here is essential. It needs to be answered, because after all, this didn't just happen, and it didn't have to happen. The middle class didn't just lose its mojo. We got here because for many years now, for 30 years, special interests have been buying public policy. So even when so-called reform passes, it's filled with loopholes, and that allow the kind of disasters that we've seen this year, whether it is the BP disaster or the mining disaster, or of course the financial disaster. And at the heart of that is the recognition that more and more public policy is not in the public interest. We also, of course, have seen the shrinking of America's manufacturing sector. We've become a country that instead of making things is now making things up, like CDOs and credit default swaps and exotic derivatives. And all that I'm saying here about the financial system is not in any way to denigrate the private enterprise capitalist system, which is still the best system we have. It's really to acknowledge that the way it's operating now is not a private enterprise system. What we now have is a kind of financial oligarchy, privatized losses and socialized gains, the government picking winners and losers. And that's why so much anger has been unleashed. And what I'm making clear in the book is that the anger is across the board. This is not just the Tea Party movement. I spoke on Saturday in Minneapolis to the convention of Teamsters, all Democratic supporters, all of them angry, all of them not sure how to channel their anger. So to move to the positive part of what I have to say, I know everybody here is very busy, so I'm going to give you the cliff notes to my book. Just read section 5, which is all about solutions, because that's what I feel we need to be stressing. And we basically have a choice, both as a country and around the globe, but America here can lead the way. We have a choice at this crossroads where we are at, to follow the road of the Tea Party movement, which is basically to divide us, to scapegoat each other, and to destroy the country. Or we have a choice to tap into our better angels and recognize that even though we talk constantly about shortages of jobs, shortages of revenues, we also have an overabundance of skills, of energy, of creativity, of the power to innovate, and of time that are going underused. And the thing that has most stunned me, that I'm chronicling in this section, is the amount of resilience and creativity across the country. So we actually have launched on the Huffington Post also a section called Third World America, where we have hundreds of stories from people around the country who are taking matters into their own hands. And this is really beyond left and right. Conservatives have always talked about Edmund Burke's Little Platoons. Liberals have always talked about compassion. This is the time to bring the two together, because however much we may disagree about government's role, we can all agree that individuals and communities need to do more. So I profile in the book people ranging from Susie Buffett, Warren Buffett's daughter, who's taken her entire foundation and is using all the resources to rebuild Omaha, treating it as though it were her own family, to unemployed people like Seth Reams in Portland, Oregon, who lost his job as a concierge, filed over 500 job applications, still doesn't have a job, was beginning to feel completely useless. And, and of course, the unintended consequence of unemployment is a tremendous psychological impact of depression, of health risks, etc. So he and his girlfriend started a site called we'vegottime2help.org, and they're now helping hundreds of people. They're kind of bringing supply and demand together. And as a result, he feels completely different about his life, even though his external circumstances have not changed at all. He still does not have a job. Going to other examples, I promise to only give you two quick ones. A lawyer, and there are thousands of lawyers like that who've lost jobs, are underemployed, and are using their skills to prevent foreclosures. Decorators, including a celebrated interior designer here in New York, Stephen Gambrell, who, as well as continuing to decorate multi-million-dollar homes in the Hamptons and in Upper East Side, is now creating kits for people who are leaving homeless shelters to be able to create homes that can give them the sense that they can start over. So this is really what I'd love the media to start focusing on. I'd love all of us to keep putting the spotlight on what is working, not just on what is not, to take the spotlight away from non-stories like the balloon boy, or other non-stories even more dangerous like Reverend Jones in Florida, a complete mental case with 30 followers who suddenly dominated the media and got calls from the Secretary of Defense. Where our energy goes And where our attention goes will determine the future. And everything is at stake at the moment. For those of you who are students of history, you know that this is nothing new. In times of economic anxiety, the worst is unleashed. In this country, in the 1880s, we deported Chinese workers. In the 1930s, under Hoover, we deported American citizens of Hispanic descent. So the anger is going to be there, and when people are angry, when people are despairing, they will believe anything. Unless we put the spotlight and our attention on alternative ways to channel that anger, that taps into what is best in us, that brings us together as a country instead of destroys us. Thank you so much. Did I come under my 7 minutes?
You're perfect. Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, I was worried about having to moderate Arianna. But moderation not being my forte, I'm glad that you moderated yourself. Thank you so much for this. Now, the examples that you gave, though, I'm a little bit worried about them because they are about showing how unemployment is good because people have plenty of time to, focus their energy somewhere else. So how does that transform into better growth and innovation and entrepreneurship and employment in America?
Oh, of course, I focused on what people can do while government is failing to do its job. And the examples that I gave included very successful people, like the interior designer, who are taking their skills and doing something for their communities. Obviously, the priority of jobs and creating jobs, both at the government level and around the country, is critical. I mean, that's why I talked about the lack of a sense of urgency as we had in order to save the financial system. I mean, I believe that at the governmental level, the administration needs to come together, and I think it's going to be easier now that Larry Summers has announced his resignation. and basically...
Can you say what you think now?
Throw everything against the wall when it comes to jobs, from what the Republicans want, a payroll tax holiday, to what FDR did, like the WPA, infrastructure programs. All that is essential. All I'm saying is that it's not a substitute for what people can do.
So, one of the things that you mentioned, which is very deep and might be a long-term obstacle to anything positive coming out of this country, is this incredibly complex and rotten legacy political system with special interests, basically, as you said, dominating American politics and probably other countries as well. And you mentioned a few days ago on TV, you mentioned, this administration going from the audacity of hope to the timidity of governing. And I was wondering to what extent, that's going to disappear because of this legacy political system that we have to deal with. And, how can that system really promote the American dream, given the state that it's in?
Well, thank you for quoting that line, because I really do believe that that's what happened. The White House underestimated the economic crisis, and as a result, what they did was inadequate. And, Lloyd George, the English Prime Minister, famously said that you cannot jump across a chasm in 2 leaps. And they tried to jump across a chasm in 2 leaps, and it did not work. And the reason for that is that the president's economic team consisted of brilliant people whose view of the world was entirely Wall Street-centric. And there has been a decoupling between Wall Street and Main Street. So the success of Wall Street does not translate to what is happening on Main Street.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I think we'll get back to you because, I have another 2,000 questions. We'll have to go fast. But, you talked about the spotlight that should be on positive things. No, I think that, we have the right person to talk about that or to, well, actually, you can take this in whatever direction you want. But Jack Leslie is the chairman of Weber Shandwick, which is a PR firm, one of the largest in the world. And, well, how do you respond to what Arianna just said, and what are your thoughts on innovation, entrepreneurship in this country?
Well, there's a lot in that question. In terms of spotlight on positive things, I was at a conference last week with someone from CNN, and it was an Army general who said, "Why is it that you always focus on all the negative news, and why don't you focus on the positive news?" And he said, "Well, it's not called GNN, Good News Network. We're called CNN." And so that's been a historical problem. I mean, the fact of the matter is the media tends to gravitate towards those things that can attract readers. The problem that I have to compliment Arianna for what she's done with the Huffington Post, because all of us in our business are trying to figure out where this is going, and no one really has an answer. But we do know, in some respects, the print model is one in print where I would argue the journalism model may be intact, but the business model is broken. In broadcast, actually the business model is probably okay. CNN makes a lot of money, but the journalism model is broken, and it's all about inflaming, not informing, and that's what we're beginning to see. And so the question is, how do we start to get content that is not so much that it's positive per se, but that it adds important constructive element to the public discourse? That's the thing that troubles, I think, so many of us. How do we have a media that has a business model attached to it that allows it to survive but still can engage in constructive discourse? I think that's what you're trying to do, Arianna, but it's because the technology has changed. And the last point I just make on the competitiveness, in our business, the reason why this model has changed so much is obviously because of technology and the internet, but it's moved from a broadcast model to an engagement model. We're no longer about putting messages out and hoping people are listening and behave in a certain way. We're all about trying to figure out how to engage them, and we have the technology now that allows us to do that. So that's creating a whole different dynamic, and it's creating, frankly, a whole different competitive landscape for not only companies in the media business, but all companies who have to start treating their customers less like consumers and more like advocates and people who are really going to advocate their brand or their service or what have you.
If I may just quickly respond, because you are so right. And if people who produce television or newspapers or still are in the legacy media and really understood that we've moved into an engagement model, they would act differently. Because everything that I described here, just a few examples I gave, are all over the web. Right. It's like the way that people are connecting on the web. If you go there and see all that's happening, the engagement among people for solutions, as well as for sharing their struggle, is extraordinary. And when people say people want to hear about Reverend Jones, I don't believe that for a minute. They created Reverend Jones. Right. Nobody knew about him. And the numbers who tune in are still infinitesimal compared to the numbers in the country. It's just lazy journalism. Right. It takes a lot more work to tell stories that are not good stories in the sense of Pollyanna or Hallmark cards. They're significant demonstrations of how people are reacting to bad times. Their journalism, their news. I know at the Huffington Post, about 2 years ago, I assigned one of our reporters to be a reporter whose only job would be to put flesh and blood on the economic data. So he basically told the stories of the unemployed and the foreclosed, and it's been a huge bonanza for the Huffington Post, who didn't set out to do it as a traffic booster, but people got engaged with that. People started sending him more stories, responding to what he was doing. So you're absolutely right. The technology is facilitating this kind of journalism. We just have to use it.
Right.
Well, thank you. I have opinions which I will share later. But so Richard Robb is going to give us the financial perspective. Richard is the CEO of Christofferson Robb, which is an investment management firm, but is also a professor at Columbia University. And so, Richard.
Yeah. I I would like to respond to what Arianna said, and I'm sure I'll learn many things when I read your book, which
You can have it.
Oh, my goodness! Wow.
Don't
Well,
read
thank
it
you
right
very
now.
much.
We need
No,
to
no,
start.
no.
She signs it, though.
Okay, not
a lot
yet.
more valuable.
Maybe you'll sign it for me before we go. But I would like to respond, though, to the remark that we've no longer become a country of making things, and the suggestion that somehow that's a bad thing or a reversible thing. If we go back 100 years ago, when people worked in agriculture in this country and in Europe, and productivity in agriculture grew in 20s, 30s, 40s, and nobody works in agriculture anymore. And you say in England, oh, without the yeoman farmer, we'll no longer have an England anymore. And the yeoman farmer is gone, and England still prospers and thrives. The United States is an agricultural powerhouse because we have comparative advantage in agriculture, but people don't work in it. And it's hard to imagine that people will be working in manufacturing because the same thing is happening, because it has such massive productivity increases in manufacturing. And it seems to me that the transition to a pure service economy where we produce ideas and services, as many of the examples of the people you cited really are in the idea of producing business, is the future of this country. And we are a dynamic country. We're built for change. And that's the way forward, rather than trying to revive our manufacturing base, which I'm sure is not precisely what you have in mind. And let me just say one word on behalf of Wall Street and financial innovation. You know, there's plenty of blame to go around for the mortgage crisis, besides financiers, state laws that encourage antisocial practices, brokers, house price speculators, investors, financiers, rating agencies, regulators, all have their role in this. And as for credit default swaps, you know, there were some embarrassing moments involving AIG, but their role in this crisis, I really feel, has been very vastly overstated. Maybe they become symbolic for things that have spun out of control and that we don't understand, or that many regulators or policymakers don't understand. But you know, I hope that we don't turn our back on financial innovation, which has fueled so much prosperity around the world and in the United States, and will continue to do so. So I've said enough antagonistic things. Maybe I'll let you respond.
I would love to address both these things. The first, obviously, you're absolutely right. We're not going to return to any stage, you know, whether it's the heavy manufacturing stage or the agrarian stage. You know, my favorite Greek philosopher, Heraclitus, said that you can never enter into the same river twice. So I have no glamorizing of any particular historic golden age. But I think what has happened, and I don't know if you agree with Simon Johnson, but I think Simon Johnson has described the financialization of the economy and the way in which the financial sector is absorbing a larger and larger percentage of our GDP, of profits. And when I say making things, I'm not suggesting, you know, making widgets or cars. Making ideas is just as important. I mean, the iPad may be produced in China, but it was dreamed up in Silicon Valley. And we are, as you said, a country, you know, that dreams up products and ideas, and whether they're made here or not is not the most significant part. But the financialization of our economy has led to this decoupling of the financial sector, which was supposed to be enabling the real economy. And it's now become a sort of a world unto itself. Obviously, we are both oversimplifying, and we both know that that's not the full truth. But for the sake of staying within the parameters of this panel, that's really what is troubling. And the fact that you had CEOs of Wall Street companies that did not understand what was happening. Of course, credit rating agencies completely failed to do their job. And that's really what we need to address. And we are all agreeing that this is still the best system we have. The question is how to make it function in the interest of everyone.
So I have a question for both of you. I mean, what is going on right now? Is that a financial crisis or the result of a financial crisis, or is that something deeper here? A crisis of what? How do we restore the American dream if that's what has been disappearing? Is this a crisis of values? I mean, what is the? It feels like there is much more to it than just financial crisis here, right?
Okay, I'm going to stick with your program to say something positive about
all
this.
Yeah, say something positive.
We haven't really had a real recession in this country since 1982. And the last time we had high unemployment. And unemployment also is a time of job search where people sort themselves, in this time out of manufacturing into services in 81, 82, and then 82, 83. When we had 10% unemployment and somewhat shorter spells than we have now, which is averaging 33 weeks. And after the Great Moderation, of course, it was a time when financial institutions, households, took on a lot of leverage because it seemed safe at the time under the circumstances. Looking back on it now, some of it was quite foolish. But there's a great deal of what we're seeing now that is really quite old-fashioned about this recession. And the reductions of output, down 2.9% in 2009, unchanged in 2008. I don't mean to be unsympathetic to the distress of the individuals, but keeping this at the abstract level, where we don't have to be sympathetic. You look at the data, and the loss of employment, the loss of output, and the shifting, the creative destruction that's taking place is very similar to what happened in the early 80s. And maybe because we haven't experienced one for so long. Or, I sometimes wonder if maybe because we're the baby boomers, particularly if we live in America, and this is our first real recession we've experienced at a later stage of our life, and everything that happens to us is so special, this one has to be sort of the one that we feel is different from all other recessions. But in many ways, we may look back at this as we thought the business cycles were dead forever, and it turns out they weren't. That's a disappointment. But, show me why this is that different from 1981, 82.
But Richard, Richard, it didn't have to happen. That's what makes it different. We did not have to abolish Glass-Steagall. And when you said that we haven't had many recessions, that's not an accident. It's because a system was put in place during the New Deal that prevented the system from falling apart. And then we moved into this worshipping of deregulation. And we moved into this, as Larry Summers, famously said, what was being unleashed in the new century and what all the world that was going to come. And we saw what happened. We just basically started tearing the system apart, and the consequences are here to see.
Okay. Glass-Steagall was put in place to separate banking and investment banking because because banks were lending to their industrial affiliates, which was certainly not the problem this time around.
No, but the fundamental principle, I'm sorry to interrupt, was to separate the taxpayer from systemic risk. That's the key. It's like I'm all in favor of capitalists taking as much risk as they want. That's the nature of capitalism. They can do whatever they want as long as I, the taxpayer, am not on the hook. And the American taxpayer is still on the hook. Despite the financial reform bill, there is still systemic risk, and we're still going to pay for it.
Right. And you think the bailout was not a good,
I think
in general, the bailout wasn't a good idea.
I was in favor of bailing them out, but not without strings attached, not without conditions. I mean, Richard, you would agree that allowing Goldman Sachs to get 100 cents to the dollar as a counterparty to AIG is not consistent with good capitalism.
I will agree with you on that.
Okay.
All right. Well, so speaking of Goldman Sachs, I mean, Jack, you want to add something?
Well, no, I was actually going to try to jump into that by saying that putting Glass-Steagall aside and Goldman Sachs, I don't think you can say, Arianna, that cycles do happen. I mean, I think that we'll have a recession, mark my word, at some point in the next 100 years that follows this one, no matter how good or bad policy might be. I'm not disagreeing actually with a number of your policy points, but I think to say, hey, we just didn't have to have the cyclical thing happen doesn't really recognize history. I think it's not so much a cyclical thing, just like it's the same old recession like we had in '82. I'm more, and I don't think it's because we've lost our way and lost our values as America. I don't buy that at all. I do think, though, we're in the midst of a huge sea change that happens, oftentimes once every century, that's causing just big dislocation. That not unlike when we went into an industrialized world, we are now moving from this mass production model to a sort of customized production model. Big businesses, the way they were structured, can't be structured anymore. Leverage got way out of hand. I don't think it's a problem, by the way, with capital here. I think we have too much capital here. I think you'd agree, and not enough capital in places really where we should have it in the developing world. And we now have this ability in this new kind of customized production as opposed to mass production of not having to worry whether we're making it here. We can make the Nike shoes in Indonesia, but if we're the ones driving that because we understand what customers want, and we're the ones driving those needs of the customers wherever they might be in the world, we, and when I say we, I mean we Americans, can succeed. But I just think we're in a period of just sort of profound change. We didn't get the policy right, no doubt about it. But I think we'd be naive not to think we can go through this kind of sea change and not see dislocation in our economies, and that's what we're seeing. That's what we're seeing right now. And a lot of people will be out of work because there's not really jobs for them anymore. Well, they're going to have to get, and we'll have to.
Okay, a quick word because I'd like to transition to
just very, very quickly. I'm not looking for some kind of utopian future where nobody's unemployed and there are no cycles. That's not at all what I'm talking about. I think that there are structural imbalances that need to be corrected. And I think when you talk about a crisis of values, there's no question that there is a crisis of values at the heart of it as well. There is the fact that so many people thought that there was a shortcut to the American dream, that there was a kind of no down payment, no proof of income, ticket to the good life, is not what this country was built on. The fact that this was encouraged by companies that ended up making billions of dollars made this problem as widespread as it was. The fact that you had credit card companies offering teaser rates, which suddenly skyrocketed to 28% and 30% because the usury laws had been eliminated in so many states, and the fact that you had mortgage companies offering all these incredible deals, which then led people soon after to lose their homes. So there are problems that are both questions of values, but also questions of business practices that need to be curtailed.
So just for the record, I would like to say that Arianna and Jacques, you disagree, right? Yeah. Well, so go ahead, and then we'll finish with Dambisa.
So I guess my response to that is, I think looking back, what caused those companies, and I don't want to get into this because I guess my interest is in what do we do to get out of this. But I would say a lot of that is, the corporations were serving that need because they were a reflection of social policy. So for many years in this country, we've had a desire that everyone own a home. And that was pushed through Congress, and that was pushed really as early as the 1940s. So to me, it's creating the right incentive structures in this country. What do we want, our economy, what do we want our businesses to look like? And making sure that we're not creating any kind of unintended consequences with our policy to impede a lot of that progress. So to me, the most important things to get us out of this ditch really come down to one, inspiration, not just regulation, but inspiration and also education. So I'm investing every day in emerging technology companies that are spinning out of really exciting research at university labs. They've been funded, a lot of it through federal policies and science and technology. But you still need to create and incentivize and inspire that next generation of entrepreneurs.
So I have mixed feelings about something here. I come from Europe, and I'm in political exile here, quote unquote. I'm French originally, but there is this European way of promoting innovation, which is very top down, You know, it's like hundreds of millions of dollars of European money or individual countries' money going into promoting innovation, which means basically giving the money to big companies that will try to, you know, increase their R&D labs. I mean, that's the way that it's being done. And here we have this more of a grassroots approach to it. And I wonder if, you know, if you had any insights into, you know, which approach do you think works best? And
so I will qualify the statement by saying that many of our portfolio companies and investments have benefited from the benevolence of the federal government through grants. That said, I can point to a number of examples where that centralized model of federal R&D spending has not resulted in new enterprises being created. So even the state of New York, for instance, there's a huge initiative in upstate New York to try and create a cluster of emerging technology companies. And the reality is, it's served to create a workforce for a lot of large multinational corporations like IBM and Intel that have gone up there. But I wouldn't say it's created jobs. It's probably moved them away from areas like Texas or San Jose. And if you look, quite frankly, at where a lot of these jobs and new companies are being created, it's these clusters of innovation that generally you could point to not only, you know, educational institutions and research institutions, but precedents of success and people that have created businesses that have been rewarded as entrepreneurs. And I think that that leadership by example, by a student at Stanford or MIT who can point to one of their professors that has spun a new business off, it's created you know, hundreds of jobs, thousands of jobs, and created wealth, I think that inspires a lot of students, and you end up seeing a lot of that replicating itself on all of these major campuses around where they've seen that success has already been demonstrated.
so it's by inspiration and it's emergent rather than prescriptive. I mean, I mean, that's my view, so I'd like you to share it.
Yeah, that's my view. So I mean, so we're you know, as a venture capital firm, we're trying to reverse engineer that process and understand what can we do to also incentivize.
What are the right conditions under which this can happen, right?
Right.
Okay.
And so another thing that we're doing is, you know, a concern of ours, because we're investing in the physical sciences, not as much internet and software, but hard sciences, biology, chemistry, physics. We recognize that there's just a dearth of those students that are proficient in that in American institutions. The reality is, if you went and looked at most of our 25 companies, I'd say 75% of them were probably born in another country, or at least their family was. Right. So it's heavily really reliant upon immigrants. So what we're trying to do right now, and one of my partners started something called the USA Science and Technology Festival, which is going to be the largest science festival in the world. It's happening in October on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. But we're trying to do that from the grassroots, ground up level to make sure that we can inspire a generation of students, K through 12, so that they don't think of a scientist or someone who's in technology like Albert Einstein, which most of them do, by the way. If you ask, and there's been polling done that shows, you know, who is a scientist, people think of a man with crazy white hair and a lab coat. So we're trying to prove and present people with role models that are different from Britney Spears or from other athletes.
Well, actually,
I think Arianna should be resonated with that a lot.
Totally. I think this is fabulous. I'm in complete agreement. I have an entire section in my book on innovation, the power of innovation in this country. And again, we are coming sort of full circle to that same point, that by putting the spotlight on what is working, by creating role models, by creating, if you want, positive infections as opposed to negative infections, we are affecting what's happening.
I would like to point out, though, that you've just created a bad example by basically rewarding this guy's bad behavior by, you know, signing a book and giving him
Not kidding.
So, all right. Yes, thank you. So we spoke about Goldman Sachs before, and Dambisa, I don't know if that's your favorite introduction to you, but so you did work at Goldman Sachs, and thank God you left. Years ago.
I left?
Sorry?
Teasing, yes.
Dambisa Moyo is an economist and a writer. She wrote one book, and there is one coming out in January, I think.
Right, yeah.
The book that she wrote, which is a great book called Dead Aid, Why Aid is Not Working and How There is a Better Way for Africa, is, I think, could be a good starting point for how do you think aid can be used to promote, entrepreneurship, innovation in developing countries, in Africa in particular. And then your new book is about how the West was lost, 50 years of economic folly and the stark choices ahead, which I think is another good starting point for, where do you think we stand now, and what is going to happen to us into the American dream, which will be restored by setting good examples, Arianna, not giving in to pressure.
Well, I guess the worst thing about being the last person to speak is that everything's been said. But being an economist, I'm going to sort of recast it in the way that I talk about it in the book, but also in the manner in which I see it. And first of all, I must say again, with all due respect, I do think that the financial sector has been overused as a scapegoat in this situation. And there are lots of reasons for that, and we can come back to that later. From the economic lens, we tend to look at economies using three basic ingredients. And I liked what was said earlier about, in a sense, we have to go back to basics. And we basically know, after 500 years of data on how countries and economies grow, that the three key ingredients are capital, their labor, and total factor productivity. And the reality is, in the United States in particular, but across Western Europe in general, these three things have been misallocated, certainly over the past 50 years. And I think the main argument in my new book is that they've actually been misallocated because public policy has supported overly bad investments in these different sectors. So let me just quickly give you some examples, and I liked what you said a moment ago. If you look at the housing sector in the United States, it's very easy to say, oh my God, it was the bankers' fault, and perhaps overly focus on what has happened in the past few years. But actually, this is the sort of most recent step in what I would consider a systematic decline in the United States and the erosion of the capital base in this country because of bad policy. In particular, the policy that was alluded to a moment ago, which is the housing for all policy. It simply cannot be the case that a country should be providing housing to a population that cannot afford it. And we've obviously come to realize that now. But I think to focus on the banks and not to accept that it was a confluence of factors, in particular the fact that you had baby boomers, you had the government established Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac institutions, but also you've had a period of long-term low interest rate environment. And the three of these things together kept the housing market much higher than it actually should have been. In the labor front, clearly things like pensions are misallocated, mispriced options. We've seen whole industries decimated in the United States because of a policy of encouraging pensions. That is not to say that we should not be coming up with clever and innovative ways to provide for older generations as people age, but certainly at some point we should be thinking about ways of solving the problem as opposed to kicking it forward, which is what has happened in the United States. And then, of course, with respect to total factor productivity, although, yes, productivity has improved in the United States and continues to improve, it's clearly quite sectoral. And in that sense, I think there are a lot of fears, certainly from my perspective, that there's overinvestment in areas that perhaps do not have a broad social appeal or benefit, such as high-frequency trading, for example. And that could be at the cost of investment in innovation in food security or in energy policy, which are things that obviously are desperately needed in this country. To sum up, I would just say that where does this leave the United States, in my view? I think the US has what I'm calling a Hobson's choice. It can either stay open and sort of pursue a policy of trying to fix the current situation of the misallocation in these three ingredients by staying as part of the global community, which I think, as somebody who does not come from the United States, I think that's what we would like to see. However, I think that the investment in education, as Obama announced with the 3% of GDP, the investment in infrastructure, the $45 billion and subsequent other amounts, and other bits and pieces are simply not big enough to actually alter the path that this country is on right now. And in addition, I think the whole strategy of trying to solve the US problems, US structural problems in the current context will not yield good results, especially because they rely very much on the rest of the world playing fair. And we can spend a whole panel talking about the fact that it's unlikely that we're going to see countries like China play fair certainly in exchange rate policy and trade. On the other hand, the United States could take the approach of becoming much more closed, closing off in terms of trade, in terms of capital movement, and really focusing, and maybe even just for a short period of time, on trying to redress the fundamental structural problems that the country is facing today. I think that, unfortunately, for a lot of political reasons, and I do think that political myopia in this country has yielded some really bad problems and structural issues in the economic sector. But I would say that I think that there's been such a negative association with protectionism and issues around structuring, subsidizing certain sectors, to the point that it's become such a fringe issue. So the notion of talking about protectionism around the trade in the United States is sort of considered a Tea Party or very kind of Lou Dobbs discussion. And yet, if we are open-minded, and in fact, the University of Chicago, there have been some amazing papers that have come out. If we are open-minded and looked at the performance of Americans in terms of their income and in terms of income inequality in this country over the period where the United States has become more global in the past 30 years, you will see that Americans, on average, have not benefited as much as they could have from this society being as open. So I'll leave it there. I'm sorry, I've probably spoken more than I should have. But I mean, from my perspective, I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and it's not yet being done as I see the case.
Arianna, any
Well,
or
actually,
anyone else?
I loved what you said about the fact that what's being done is not big enough and not bold enough to alter the path this country is on. I just was hoping it's going to be 140 characters because I'm planning to tweet it. Because I was counting characters while I was writing it down. Because it's exactly what I feel our choice is. And in a sense, we may disagree about what we need to do, but I think we agree that we are on a path, which I call a path to third world America. You are calling it a path that maybe leads to the world being lost. But the point is that we are on a dangerous path. And the policies have to be both big and bold when government can act, like infrastructure. We've got to fix our infrastructure. That's not something which can be done from Silicon Valley. I mean, Silicon Valley can come up with creative ideas of how to do it better, how to short-circuit the process, but the government has to take the initiative. And if it doesn't happen, we're going to have a lot more San Brunos. What happened in California when pipes that were 50 years old exploded could be happening all around the country. At the same time, I agree with you that there is personal responsibility here in terms of, say, and you mentioned that point too, the idea that everybody needs to own their home, which was perpetuated by George Bush with the ownership society. You know, there's here blame to go around everywhere. But also there's no question that financial companies, mortgage companies, took huge advantage of that. And they basically made packages available that made no sense financially. And the only reason they made sense for them is because they were not carrying the risk. They basically separated themselves from the risk. And so they could offer policies which they would never have offered if they were the only ones carrying the policy. And ultimately, they were offering, the taxpayer was on the hook. And that's, I think, at the heart of a lot of the anger that has been unleashed around the country.
So it's interesting because this panel was supposed to be about innovation and entrepreneurship. But in fact, we've been talking about the basic needs that we as a country have to get back to innovation and entrepreneurship and the American dream. So it feels like there is this layer that is necessary before we can even talk about the other things. That's really interesting. Now, in response to what you just said, Dambisa, I mean, I have a question for you. You said that if we remain open, we can't assume that the rest of the world will play fair. But then if we get more closed, I mean, it's likely the rest of the world will react very violently. I mean, the U.S. is really a major driver of the world economy. So what?
Well, I mean, I think to that point, but by the way, I should give you my disclaimer. I actually love this country. I mean, it's amazing. Every time I come here.
Oh, so you're not a Tea Party?
No,
okay.
No, but I say that only because I do think that one can get sort of almost narcissistic in their head about being so important. And I think that the US, in a way, is kind of on the verge of that. Mm-hmm. The reality is the emerging markets have surpassed the United States as the largest contributors to GDP growth on Earth. And by the emerging markets, I'm talking about the bigger economies. And in addition,
well,
China,
but I mean, turn off the American economy, and what happens to the rest of the world? I mean,
well, I'll tell you, domestic demand in China, in Brazil, in Russia is double digits this year. Yes, there is still interdependency for sure, but I'm just saying that let's not overplay the fact that the trend is what I would consider much more of a decoupling. So the reality is, of course, the United States is the biggest economy on earth. In terms of per capita incomes, this is still a very important country. China is second in terms of GDP, but look at the per capita numbers. It's still got a long way to go. But I think it's very important to understand that the strategy of being adopted around the world is not to sort of sit back and rely on the United States as an engine for economic growth. It really is focusing on
but I mean, I absolutely agree with you, and I think we are narcissistic about that and thinking that we're the sole engine. But I do disagree with you, and I was kind of surprised on the openness remark, having read Debt Aid, in that not so much that the U.S. is going to be the path to growth for Africa, let's say, but certainly our role in developing the rules of the road in trade is very important. And if we decide to take on a closed posture and a protectionist policy, I think it makes it very difficult to think that we're going to get agreement in the world for the kinds of trade rules that are really going to be, in the end, the way out for a continent like Africa. So I just worries me because the same kind of discussion obviously happened, just before we hit the real depression, when we all said, hey, we got to fix our own problems and turn inward, and we created a huge problem. So I take your point. We shouldn't think that and we often do, that we're the only engine for growth, but we're still pretty darn important in developing and playing a leadership role in developing the rules, the trade rules that govern us. And I'd hate to think that our policymakers start to move back from.
Well, I will say that you say that about the U.S. setting trade rules, but certainly many African countries suffer under the farm subsidy program.
Oh, absolutely.
Not just in the United States, which is a multi-billion-dollar program. Absolutely. So certainly in that context, the United States is not.
We've been wrong. No, absolutely.
So can you say a word, Dambisa?
I should say the free trade. Those who espouse a free trade policy, not our negotiators necessarily.
Fair enough.
Who kept the farm subsidies.
Peter Hebert will say a word, but after he asks his question or makes his comment, I'd like you to spend 1 minute or 2 minutes on how to, about your previous book, basically, how to redirect aid or change the way that we allocate aid to promote, the kind of things that you want to promote, as opposed to the farm subsidies that were a disaster, as you said. So, Peter?
One important comment I want to make is on the difference and the distinction between national competitiveness and innovation and employment as well, because a lot of these sometimes get commingled. I'll just give you one example that blew my mind from that I learned about in the past 2 weeks. One of the companies that we're an investor in Silicon Valley makes touchscreen materials that end up going onto mobile phones and all these devices now, like unfortunately, the iPad and Apple, but there we're creating innovation, we're differentiating ourselves from a lot of other lower cost labor countries. But what's interesting is that the designers and a lot of the marketers in Apple have created a product that ultimately created far more in the way of jobs overseas. So just one example is this company that I'd never heard of, and these numbers are probably roughly right, but a company called TPK in China. It was a 200-person company in 2007. They won the award for the Apple iPhone touchscreen materials. It is now 200,000 employees 3 years later. So there it's an example of just as much as we can do to incentivize innovation and other things within this country, doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to get any closer to full employment. In many ways, we're actually improving the lives of all these others in other countries.
I think, though, you're focusing on technological innovation. Maybe there are other forms of innovation, like business model innovation, like service innovation, that might create jobs in this country, right?
I still think there's a huge disconnect between the types of industries that we're investing in today, as both from a federal perspective and also from an investor perspective and the labor force that exists in this country. And there is going to continue to be a very turbulent period where if you look at the industries that employ large amounts of people, it was manufacturing. Given a lot of the policies of the past 10 years, it became housing. But as much as I'd like to be a very strong supporter of the concept of green jobs, I still don't believe that any of those are realistic possibilities of the types of employment you could have in this country. And we're still investing in those areas, but I think it would be foolish to assume that with hundreds of thousands of people that are unemployed in the Midwest are just magically going to find employment because we're creating a federally mandated battery industry where we're at a structural disadvantage to Asia, as is. So it's what kind of industries are we going to create? And I think there are some significant problems that ultimately will involve the government to be able to take some of these high unemployment areas and start putting people back to work. But it's challenging to find those industries where we can be competitive, and also there are hundreds of thousands of people that would need to be hired.
Dambisa, one last word before we open the discussion to the floor.
Yes, sure. So in the context of Africa, just to set the stage, this is about 1 billion people where over 60% of the population is under the age of 24. So, and one other thing is about 70% of the population lives on less than $1 a day. And if you look back into the 1970s, about 10% of the African population lived on less than $1 a day. Today, as I said, we've got 70% of the population living on less than $1 a day. So things have actually gotten worse. At the same time, where there's been a massive influx of capital onto the continent, which is not private capital, but it's largely in the form of aid. I want to very quickly just make a distinction. I'm not talking about emergency aid or charity who send $20 to build a well. I'm talking about large wholesale transfers in the multi-billions of dollars that go from government to government or from international aid institutions to Africa. The fundamental problem here is that there's a whole list of problems, which I detail in my book, a lot of them economic arguments on inflation, debt burden, corruption, and so on. But I think the key problem which the African continent has suffered from and continues to suffer from is that the fact that the capital coming in, the money coming in the form of aid, creates or cuts the link between the individual and the government. So in other words, when you live in the United States, the deal with the government is that they will tax you, and in return, the government will provide you a suite of public goods, which are education, infrastructure, healthcare, and national security. In Africa, those goods are provided by the international community, and therefore, Africans on the ground are unable to hold their governments to account. Now, you might be saying to yourselves, what the heck does that mean, or what does that relate, how does that relate to innovation? Well, you have a society where the government has no vested interest in job creation or building industries or companies because they know that the suite of public goods will actually be provided by outsiders. It is completely unsustainable, and it's interesting being here in the United States at a time when some 43% of Americans are not paying federal taxes, and at a time where there's a lot of issues around innovation, because the primary problem in Africa is that we're unable to create jobs, we're unable to spur innovation, simply because the governments, I believe, by and large, and not every government, but a lot of the governments are not incentivized to actually create an environment where they can build a society that they would create.
So there's an interesting parallel here between what you say and the bailout in the U.S., for example, where there is a decoupling, where there's this money that just lands on everywhere.
Yeah.
There's some heterogeneity in the way the money lands. I mean, it didn't land in my pockets, for example, for some reason. But there's a decoupling, right?
But I think more importantly than the decoupling is that it's unsustainable. I come from a country.
Well, that too, yes.
Well, I come from a country where 1 in 5 people has HIV/AIDS. And the majority of the drugs that are provided in my country are provided by the United States government. But the United States government is fighting off double-digit unemployment in this country. Americans elect the American government and therefore expect the American government to solve the American problems. So does it make sense for people in Zambia or across the African continent to sit back and wait for the U.S. to hand out largesse? It seems unsustainable. And those are the issues we need to be discussing.
Well, so you're right. So, but the parallel that I wanted to draw was here. All this money comes in, and we feel like, okay, well, it's fine. Yeah. but that's not sustainable. And, that's not a way to promote innovation for the long term, and people feel cheated, and something's wrong. So, I mean, I guess that's the problem. Obviously, we can still hold our government accountable. I mean, I guess, and I think so. Yeah. So I'd like to open the discussion to the audience. If you have any question, please go ahead.
Howard Gardner question about governance. You started out by talking about the fact that public policy now is dominated by lobbyists and interest groups, and that's obviously true both for the Congress and increasingly for elections. Then when you gave the examples from Chapter 5, which I have not read, or Section 5,
I mean, you could have a copy if, if
they were inspiring personal examples, but I didn't really address the issue of how does one change that governance. So my question for you is a kind of a middle-of-the-night question. Do you sometimes have existential doubts about whether the American system can deal with these issues compared to, say, Singapore and China, where they don't have the vexing problems of lobbyists? And if you do think, what's the script for getting to a government that's more accountable to Main Street and the Tea Party and the other issues that you touched on at the beginning? Thanks.
Well, that's a great question, and in my desire to focus on something new, I focused on what is happening around the country that people are not as familiar with. But trust me, there is a lot of policy prescriptive stuff in the book, and I actually do start with precisely the issue that you mentioned, which is the need to fix the way we finance campaigns. I'm completely in favor of a public financing of campaign system. I don't think anything else will work. There are always going to be far too many loopholes, as we saw after we passed McCain-Feingold. And basically, right now, there are 26 lobbies for every elected official. The public does not stand a chance. Just watch while the current financial reform bill gets watered down to complete mush. I mean, all my friends on Wall Street, and I'm sure Richard's friends privately, are just very happy. They are saying, okay, okay, now we can get our hundreds of lobbyists up on the Hill and get all the loopholes we want, and the game will continue the way it is until the next disaster. And J.K. Galbraith wrote a really good, small little book about the euphoria, the collective euphoria around financial crisis and how short our memory is. The financial crisis is over, and quickly we move on as though nothing had happened until the next financial crisis, or indeed until the next tulip mania. It wasn't just about financial crisis. It was about learning lessons from our mistakes. Is always hard, especially around crises like that. That's why we need to have a system that discourages the kind of buying of public policy that we have seen. And it's just one last thing, the way this influences innovation. What happened in Detroit is a very good example of that. Sure, pensions were a problem, but the bigger problem was that Detroit spent billions of dollars buying public policy, buying loopholes around SUVs, basically buying the kind of policy that allowed them not to have any reduction of fuel efficiency standards, to continue producing cars that were unsustainable, and then spending billions of dollars to drum up demand for them. So it was basically a completely dysfunctional system, which ended up with Detroit going bankrupt and the taxpayer bailing them out.
All right. Well, thank you. This is the, one last question for all of you, so you have a chance to say anything you want, Richard, because I think Richard wants to respond.
Yes, I'm going to misbehave.
Richard and his friends want to respond.
I would like to misbehave some more.
So Richard first, and then I'll ask you a question, and then we'll...
Richard is about to misbehave. I'm going to take my book back.
Oh, no, I want to get more books out of it.
Yes.
Because I would like to, actually, I've been meaning to read your book, and if you have one...
You have a copy?
I'm afraid not. I don't believe in age.
Well, I'll have to buy it.
You have to go buy it.
I'll buy it in the bookstore. I'm prepared to do that.
And then she'll sign it.
No, because in my day job, we do invest in emerging countries. activities according to capitalist principles. And I find that it creates more authentic financial institutions. It's more dignified for the people that we deal with. And I think I'm quite sympathetic to the arguments. I would just to speak up one more time for Wall Street. Take high frequency trading. Okay, so some people devote their efforts to doing that, 500, 1,000 people. And maybe they could be doing other things. Why don't we get rid of professional chess, too? Like maybe we could find more productive and have them go work in the workers' collective factory somewhere and run that. I mean, it's a dangerous business to try to decide what's socially productive and what isn't. And you know, okay, maybe they're smart. We have the expression, if you could make it in New York, you could make it anywhere. The converse is probably true. If you could make it here, you couldn't make it anywyer else. And most of the people who work in this field probably couldn't do anything else
Richard,
anyway.
I'm sorry, but I can't believe you said that, because I just can't believe that you are not focusing on what we're saying, which is, I don't really care what people do, or how much risk they take, or whether they want to be professional traders and chess masters at the same time. I don't want the taxpayer to have any responsibility when they fail. That's my only demand.
I agree with you.
But,
just,
you know,
but high frequency trading is far removed from that.
You know, you may personally agree with me, but Wall Street has spent an enormous amount of money trying to undermine precisely the kind of reforms that would have made that possible. The Volcker rule, there's some kind of modern reinstatement of Glass-Steagall, all the things that would have insulated the taxpayer from Wall Street misbehaving, because Wall Street will continue to misbehave, as you just demonstrated. And, and we don't want to be on the
Let me
hook.
see.
No. I mean, you can take it offline, you know, and find a dark room.
Can I say one more word about science? You know, I think the science education.
I can regain control.
The science education project is quite meritorious. But after you finish these two books, I can highly recommend a book called Venturesome Consumption by my colleague Amar Bideh, who shows convincingly that where innovations are, where scientific discoveries take place, has little to do with where they create prosperity among nations. It's where can they be absorbed. And here in the United States, we, as consumers, we can absorb technology that's created elsewhere. If you take a country like India, which has many disruptive technologies and distinguished engineers and scientists, and has a GDP of 1,050 per capita, because they don't have an economy that's built to absorb the technologies that they produce. So the idea that science is going to get us there is a myth which has no foundation in data.
Thanks. Well, so one simple question. You have 30 seconds each to say something or not. Let's examine, Arianna, let's examine an interesting scenario for 2012. Sarah Palin gets elected. You know, the Tea Party is in charge. What does that do to innovation and employment and entrepreneurship?
Is that a long question?
Well, I own a house in Nova Scotia, and there'll be one less American probably here if that all happens. That's my 2 seconds worth. And it won't happen, thankfully.
Oh, all right. Richard? Sarah Palin, president, what happens?
I'm sorry?
Palin is president.
All right.
Oh,
2012.
goodness.
Wow.
I mean, that's not my territory. I'll give my time to
Arianna.
Arianna.
He's giving you his 30 seconds.
I'll come stay with you in Nova Scotia. There's room for you. I would like to join you there.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I got a book, a place to stay. This place is great. Okay.
Well, I have a house in Provence if you want to join.
Oh, well, that sounds nicer than...
Okay.
Well, okay, I'm
Summers.
here to stay. No matter who is elected, I'm here to stay, because I have chosen this country. I love this country. I believe in this country. And I believe whoever is in the White House, we will be able to turn things around ultimately, provided, as Churchill said, you know, Americans can be counted to always do the right thing after they have exhausted all other possibilities. So maybe Sarah Palin getting elected will be
But what does it
do?
do to, in your mind, to entrepreneurship in business, in innovation in this country?
Well, first of all, we are discussing two separate things going on at once. What government is doing to promote innovation and to discourage bad things happening, and what the private sector is doing. And I think what the private sector can thrive under all circumstances. We've seen the private sector thriving under totalitarian regimes, let alone Sarah Palin. So I think that we need to remember that. You know, democracy is not a spectator sport. So we're not just dependent on who is elected. And that's why I feel it's time. I mean, trust me, I do not want to minimize the damage that electing Sarah Palin will do. But I want to discourage.
This is on the record, you know.
I want to discourage some of our best and brightest fleeing to Nova Scotia.
But not
Maybe you would like me to go there because I just stir up trouble.
Dambisa?
I'm going to plead that I'm an economist, plead the fifth. I would, I think, reserve comments on politics. It's a bit too dodgy for me. You can have my 30 seconds.
Yeah, I mean, regardless, I would agree with Arianna that regardless of who's in power, generally the private sector will find ways, even like a cockroach, to live and thrive. I would say that what we need, I think, is some predictability with regulation. I know certainly in areas that we invest, like energy, it's holding off a lot of investment right now that otherwise would be going to this country. Right. And I think we should reconsider a lot of policies to make sure that we are creating the right incentive structure. Because I have the benefit of speaking last, I guess, to Richard's earlier point about technology development being differentiated from, I think it was from the ability of a country to absorb it, or, yeah. I mean, forgetting about absorption, if we care about creating industries for the future, if you look at all of the largest employers in this country in industries, whether it's aerospace, whether it's the computer industry, whether it's biotechnology, pharmaceuticals, even oil refining, for instance, these all employ tens of millions of people in aggregate, and they're all based upon technologies that were developed here in the United States. So I disagree, and I do believe that technology leadership is key if we hope to create the industry of the future, the least of which also we hope to dominate them as well.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Thank you to the panel, and we're looking forward to new panels.
Great.